Welcome. Today I would like to talk to you about the games which I played during the last Bundesliga weekend in Düsseldorf. Our team played against the teams of König Tegel on Saturday and against Schachfreunde Berlin on Sunday. König Tegel is our main competitor, I would say, for the last place in the league. And up to that match, both teams had 0 team points, but that changed for both teams because we played a 4-4. So I think nobody can complain about that result. On Sunday, we lost to Schachfreunde Berlin by a score of 5-3, and even there, a team point was kind of within reach, I would say. This time, I want to show you both games during one video, mainly because the games are pretty short. We start off with my game from Saturday against the German Grandmaster René. I had played against René before. I know him as a very, very solid player with white. My goal was to be also quite solid with black, so let's see what happened. René opened the game with knight f3, what I also expected, and I answered with my usual move knight f6, c4, c5, and he played the move knight to c3. So in some of the old games in the league I played the move d5 here, but already against Almagy I deviated from that, playing knight c6 instead. And I think after d5 it's pretty easy to prepare for white. I don't think it's a bad line, but I think it's maybe not very practical, at least on my level, because I don't have the time to go through all of these lines. For that reason I repeated knight c6, and I was mainly expecting him to go d4, and then c takes d, knight takes d, and we get either an English symmetrical after, for instance, g6 and g3, or after e6 we get a different line, which is also relatively concrete, and that's what René played in the first games. Instead, my opponent at this point deviated by playing the move e3. This was something I had briefly looked at and where I thought this is not too dangerous, so I'm not going to spend too much time preparing that, but just saw one line which I then just played. I went for e5, and now he went for the line with d4 and d5 in one of his previous games already. So if white wants to play for an edge here, I think it is more reasonable to play the move knight to e5, and then the position gets quite sharp. But already in the previous game he played the move d5, so I was kind of expecting him to repeat that. And in this position now black has the option of going b takes c, which is a bit more sharp, but which I think is objectively maybe slightly better for white, or of going d takes c, which is a bit boring, but which I think equalizes for black. Now the queens are exchanged, and after g takes f we reach a position where the pawn structure is quite interesting. So here I have 4 versus 3, so it will be very, very difficult for me to create a passed pawn, and that's why at first glance this position might seem to be a tiny bit better for white. But on the other hand, white's pawn structure here is also not great, so also for white it will be very difficult to create a passed pawn on, say, the e-file. And for that reason, overall I think the position is balanced. The old plan in this position is to go with king to c7, but I think also there maybe white can go for a slight edge, but the new school is to go g6 in this position, and this position is known to be very, very balanced with a lot of drawing tendencies. Okay, my opponent plays the logical moves, fianchettos his bishop, and now it goes for long castle. There are some other computer games here in which white does not castle long, but I think in any case black can quite comfortably hold the position. I went for the move bishop e6, developing my last minor piece, and he did the same with a move bishop to d3. So what are the general plans for both sides? Well, white's plan is either to go for a knight maneuver to f4 to try to exchange this bishop against the knight. This is sometimes an option. Or sometimes to go for knight to e4. And after knight e4, I should always make sure that I do not have to exchange, because what I don't want is, let's say, I will now just make up a line. This is what happened. After, let's say, knight e4, what I don't want is to take on e4. Instead, I could go for something like b6, for instance, here, because after knight takes e4, f takes e4, he now has a clearly improved pawn structure. Yeah, so now this way he gets a bit more free play. Maybe he can fix it like that, and then later on with e4 and f5 create another passed pawn. And this position is then actually quite good for white. So these are white's main motives here. Black's main motive is to go for b5 at some point, but this will take a lot of time. So for the time being, black should be happy to consolidate, and then maybe later on try to attack the queen side via b5. My opponent at this point went for the move rook to g1. What's the point? Well, I think what he maybe wants to do is to make it a little bit harder for me to react to f4 in some cases, because, for instance, after bishop g4 with the rook on g1, he sometimes has motives that he can either go knight d5 or take on g4 or something like this. Yeah, this is, I think, the main idea of rook g1. And of course, also grabbing the g file. Yeah, I went for the move rook to d7, and now he played again another quiet little move, king to c2, improving his king. And you can already see that the position is very, very static. So it's very difficult for either side to do anything here. I could maybe now go for rook a8, which is equally reasonable. I played b6 first, with the idea that whenever he goes knight to e4, I can then just pass another time, maybe play just rook a8 or something, or knight e8 for that matter, and my position will be fine. He went for knight e2, with the idea of bringing the knight to f4. Yeah, but now I don't want to give up the pair of bishops, and I went for knight to e8. Yeah, and at this point, I think he has to make a crucial decision. That is whether he wants to give up the pair of bishops by taking on g7, and then the position is going to be quite even more equal than it was before. Or, and this might be slightly more risky, to go for bishop a3 at some point. Yeah, so there were some games where white managed to get bishop a3 in a favorable way, but I think here I just have a5 and maybe later a4, and the position might actually be even decent for black, because the bishop is now slightly misplaced on a3. So this kind of plan is probably better if black has not yet played b6 and maybe has already committed to rook a8. So for that reason, my opponent decided, okay, I'm just going to chop off another piece. But yeah, this limits possibilities, of course, even more. Knight g3 and rook a8. It should be noted that white does never really want to go for e4, f4, and then maybe for f5, because black's plan in this case would be to jump with a knight to d4, so maybe via e6, and that would then be quite unpleasant for white. And as such, there's not so much white can do here. I mean, he will go for f4 at some point, but even then, yeah, there's not really that much he can do. Okay, now he goes for bishop e4, and during the game I thought, okay, I'm going to exchange once, and then maybe play for the queen side. But after the game I had a brief look with the computer, and it's even fine to exchange twice on d1, because the resulting endgame is not much. So if instead of bishop d7, I could just take another time. I thought maybe something like this, but even here the computer gives a very simple move, bishop to f5, with the idea of just trading down to a pawn endgame. And I think we both thought that this kind of pawn endgame might be slightly risky for black, but in fact it isn't, because black can just put his king to e6 or e5 and then just pass. And whenever white goes e4, let's say f4 and then e4, you can still just wait and go back and forth, and there's absolutely nothing. So even this kind of a pawn endgame is just a very, very easy draw. Instead, in the game I went for bishop d7, and now for rook b8, with a glimmer of hope to actually play b5. But here my opponent also played in a quite destructive way, I would say, by playing the move bishop to d3, intending to meet b5 with knight to e4, and then I would get some pressure on the c5 pawn. So in this position, after bishop g4, I offered a draw, and after some deliberation, my opponent accepted. In terms of the team, it was not yet clear which team is doing better at this point, so there was not really any consideration like this. But the position is just, it's just very hard to imagine anyone winning from this position. So I think he would have gone for the move rook to g1. That's what we analyzed also a little bit after the game. But now maybe the easiest is to just play h5. And then let's say after h4, maybe even to go for something like this. And black goes back, and yeah, it's very, very hard to imagine a scenario in which either side breaks through, because f5 is never going to really be a big threat. And I also have the idea of regrouping the knight here to potentially play b5, but whenever I play b5, c5 might become weak. So yeah, it is really a case of neutralization, in which either side just hopes for the other side to overextend, and if neither side wants to do that, there's not so much else that you can do than to reshuffle pieces forever, and yeah, we didn't want that, so we just agreed to a draw at this point. In the second game of the weekend, I played against Kacper Piorun. Piorun has a rating of 2650, pretty strong Polish Grandmaster. And yeah, I repeated the line which I played last time against Gawain Jones, going for knight f3 followed by g3. And he also repeated the first moves, such that we ended up in a kind of King's Indian position. And now after d6, I played this b3 line again. In the Jones game, we basically reached a position after c5 here, and of course I had to look at the theory of that line after the game. But instead now Piorun surprised me with a move that I didn't know at all, by playing the move b7 to b5. Well, the main idea of black is just to grab space, and of course to fianchetto his bishop, which is kind of logical because white has both bishops or will have both bishops fianchettoed, so it's logical that black also takes the time to do the same. The first obvious question I had to answer in the game was why not just go knight to e5, because it looks like, okay, I might win this rook on a8. I thought about it for some time, but then I saw, okay, d takes e, bishop takes a8, and I had the feeling that, I mean, maybe there's bishop a3, maybe there's something else, but even after e takes d, I'm not so sure that I really want to have white in this position, because black has quite some compensation. After the game, he told me that probably there's even c6, with a sneaky idea of just capturing the bishop. So it might be that white is already clearly worse after knight e5. So in any case, yeah, I imagined that he had analyzed that, and yeah, I didn't want to lose right out of the opening, so I went for bishop to b2, which is kind of logical. And now after bishop to b7, I played the move c4. White definitely has other options here. One that was played by Georg Meyer 2 times is the move knight b2 d2. So this actually would have followed a game from Meyer against Carlsen, with the idea to play c4 on the next move, and then to take, in case black takes, to take back with the knight, leaving black with a slightly worse pawn structure. But in these lines, black goes c5 at some point, and my feeling is that there's not really so much that black should worry about. So instead, I'm quite happy with what I did. I just played the move c4 straight away, which now gives him the option of trading down, leading to a somewhat more symmetrical position. And now, yeah, note that his only remaining issue is that it's not so easy to go with c5 or e5 here. e5 is firmly blocked, and c5 I can always either take and then have maybe a slight edge, or I can just go d5 and then I should also have a slight edge because this bishop is blocked. So for that reason, he started in a more flexible way with knight bd7, and after knight bd2, he now didn't play c5 due to d5, I think, and instead went for the move e6 first. So these players, of course, against me, they don't necessarily want to make a draw with black. So he wants to keep the position flexible and maybe at the right moment play c5. Because now the point is, if I take on c5, you can always take just knight takes c5. I went rook b1 first, so now he can't go c5, because then I have just d5. In case of takes, I can just take here. And no matter how he takes back, I can just take on b7 and I win a piece. So that's not possible. For that reason, he first has to play rook to b8. And now again, I keep him busy with this move, queen to a4. Yeah, and I threaten to take on a7. And I think after c5, I can just take on a7. And here I thought I might be actually slightly better here, but he found a pretty clever way of neutralizing this idea of queen a7 by going for the move knight to e4. What is the idea? Well, the idea is if I take on a7, he has actually a pretty forcing line. Takes, and now rook takes a2. And the point is, next move will be queen a8. And then he has just a more active rook. I can give you one sample line, let's say e3. Queen a8 takes. And yeah, now black is just slightly more active. I mean, objectively, this might also be holdable for white, but of course, that's not what you want out of the opening to already be slightly worse. So after I had finished calculating this line, I thought, well, actually the piece which is kind of misplaced is his bishop on b2, because in some lines his bishop might land on e4 and attack my rook. In other lines I want my rook to be free, so I just played the move bishop to a1. Another side effect of this is of course that I'm kind of threatening rook takes b7, followed by knight e4. He kicked my queen away, and I just went back to c2, and now he exchanged on g2. Yeah, and at this point I felt like, okay, probably I'm slightly better here, but it's nothing too special. Played queen d7. And my thought was maybe he wants to go c5 at some point, and then if I play dc, then give a check and take the pawn. So I now defended against that with king to g1. I think it's a fine move. Another option here for white, maybe slightly more ambitious, would have been to go e4 just to grab space. And I think also here probably white is a tiny bit better. Instead I went for king g1. Now he plays queen c6. Now after c5 I can just take, because he doesn't no longer have this queen c6 check, so he went for queen c6. And yeah, now I activated my rook with the idea of going rook fb1, and I thought, okay, maybe I have a very slight pull here. But yeah, as is the case with this kind of players, he found a very nice maneuver, just bring the knight back to d7, and preparing to oppose on the b file. And in the game, I now didn't go for the most ambitious way of playing. I played the move rook f to b1, and then my advantage is definitely no longer there. Maybe the most interesting way here could have been rook to a3, attacking on a7, which is kind of awkward to defend. With rook b7, maybe at some point I even have queen a4. And so maybe it's a little bit awkward. You also don't really want to go a6 for similar reasons, just queen a4. So maybe it's a slight edge. The computer gives some line in which it just sacrifices this pawn, and then says after rook a7 you can go either rook a8 or rook a6, and then create enough counterplay on the a file against the pawn on a2. I mean, I still feel black has to be a little bit careful here to get the pawn back. So had I seen that, I would probably have gone for that. But yeah, during the game, I was too focused on doubling on the b file and played the less ambitious move, rook f to b1. And now he went for rook b6. And yeah, now it's clear he will get rook f to b8 in, and then the position is just almost completely symmetric, and there's not really anything either side can do. I went for rook b5, potentially with the idea of tripling on the b file, or maybe going for d5 as well. But he just kicked me away instantly, and I went back. Note that this a6 might be a very, very little weakness. At least he doesn't have any rook a6 ideas later. So now I went for rook fb8. And I played the very quiet move e3, protecting d4. And yeah, of course, it's very, very hard for black to do anything here, because you don't want to go e5, because it just weakens the squares. You don't want to go d5, because this just gives me... yeah, I don't even have to react to that, actually. So it has zero threat and comes at the risk of potentially weakening a structure. So if I, for instance, go something like queen d3 at some point and then take on d5, then you might be left with this pawn. So for black, it's very, very difficult to do anything in this position. And after quite some thinking time, he now went for the move h6, which basically tells me, well, I don't see how I can improve my position, so I go for the move h6. And then I thought for a bit myself and thought, well, I also don't really see how I can improve my position. And I went for the move h3, accompanied by a draw offer, which my opponent accepted after some thinking. Well, what could he do? I mean, he could potentially try something like queen a4, but also this does not really threaten anything, right? I mean, I could even go bishop c3, and now it's not really clear if this was good or bad, right? So he now has to look out for some tactics. Probably he will go back at some point, and then there's not really anything he can do. So another maybe not so exciting game, but of course for me it's also good to be results oriented sometimes, and if I play against somebody with 26-40, a draw is not a bad outcome. At the same time, he told me after the game that he saw my previous games and that he at least had some respect for the way I'm playing, so he didn't think I was a total putzer. And yeah, this is of course a two-sided thing. If these players with black, they try, but if they can't push without risk, then they may also take a draw. This might mean that I win fewer games, but I also, of course, maybe lose fewer games. So not sure what to think about that. Yeah, in any case, this was my weekend in Düsseldorf for the team. It was a successful Saturday, getting the first team point, and on Sunday we were relatively close to getting a second team point. In the end, lost with a 5-3. But overall, I think we can be happy with our performance in Düsseldorf. So thanks a lot for watching, and see you next time.